think our child protection systems are flawed. I'd be a hypocrite if I got up here and actually was subservient to relationships alone. We are the sum of our relationships. We've got to be collaborative in that way. We've got to be respectful and civil, but we've got to chase down the transgressions. And we can't have a nation, the 12th biggest economy on the planet, with 55,000 children removed into out-of-home care, with 150,000 child protection notification alerts, with 1 in 35, as I said yesterday, of Australia's children with a child protection notification, and with the abomination of 1 in 5 of Australia's First Nations children with a child protection notification alert. And with, in many jurisdictions, 1 in 10, 1 in 12, 1 in 13 to 1 in 14 of our First Nations children having been removed. And here in the Territory, 8,500 of the 14,000 children aged 16 years and less have had a child notification alert. What that speaks to should be the pressing issue of our time, to the intersection with poverty and extreme poverty, and what types of supports we need to put in place to validate the functions and objectives of the family, and to support them fully in terms of how they should be able to live their lives and what they should be able to access. I'm going to start a little bit about my predominant work, which is in suicide prevention, so I can lead into child protection. And for the first time in my life, I walked up here a little bit nervous today, because I feel like this is the pressing issue of our time, and it is our generation's pressing issue, suicide, but the factors that lead to suicide, the extreme poverty in terms of First Nations poverty. And it can be said that 5 out of 6 First Nations people will not be incarcerated. 5 out of 6 will live reasonably functional and good lives. But who are we to dare to actually presume that we should be leaving behind brothers and sisters to rot in corrals of human misery? Who are we to dare to not do enough of what should be done to lift people from extreme poverty? Who are we to dare to actually say that we should not be putting in the relentless psychosocial supports that were amply described by some yesterday as a dividend of agency that we have on behalf of others, that have hit the world in a way that we haven't hit the world in? I find it abominable, a moral impropriety, and I actually argue with our parliamentarians at the highest level. I sit on federal boards. I am one of those people that usually is the outlier vote, the 1 in 13 that votes the other way, or whatever, or the 1 in 10, or the 1 in 15, or the 1 in 20. Even in the tertiary sector, when I sat on my board for 4 years at the university that I was at, Murdoch University in Perth, I was considered the chief troublemaker, the radical voice. The vote was always 13-1. I was the one. But nevertheless, without burning your bridges and without going that far that all doors shut on you, you can be relentless in terms of change agency. And I'm proud of the records that I've left behind. At Murdoch University, I brought in scores of people out of the prisons, going in there pre-release and bringing them in post-release, people without an education, people that were illiterate to some extent and innumerate, into tertiary education through alternative pathway programs, and out of homelessness. And but I didn't just bridge them in, because with alternative pathway programs, 20 to 25% of the university's cohort now is actually from alternative pathway programs, people from disadvantaged backgrounds, people who are mature age, people who have disrupted childhood education, who didn't complete their education. They're the lowest student retention rate, they're the lowest graduation cohort. Most of them will actually drop out of our 44 universities in the first and second year within university, because all we do for them is some teaching and learning capacity in terms of the university to tap into and bridging courses. Then we leave them on their own. So my bit was to argue a case to support them from the point of entry to the point of exit. And that meant the psychosocial supports. For those who were homeless that I brought in that would have been vetted out of university entry, even from those other alternative pathways that were, that people tap into. I put in the psychosocial support, so I opened up the Sport and Recreation Centre from 5 in the morning so they could shower. I hired a welfare officer on campus or whatever to help them with shared accommodation where possible, where we could get that for them, and to provide the psychosocial and mentoring and the supports for them to turn to at all times. I even built a coffee shop on campus, a hole in the wall at the library, so we'd be open after hours so they didn't have to live off vending machines. those types of supports matter. I organised for the barber on campus to be paid a subsidy to actually do free haircuts or whatever. Right? They're the things that they actually ask, to feel good, to fit in. That's what the psychosocial actually means. And then the other point of entry to point of exit support was actually creating programs that they could be supported. In the university, we were all loggerheads over this because they were cost aversive, not necessarily risk aversive, but cost aversive. Cost aversive is more onus put on that than other risks. And I supported them from the point of entry to the point of exit with tutoring in every unit of study of their degree. They went on to become the highest student retention rate of any cohort in the university, the highest graduation rate. So the majority of them graduated. People out of prison that I distinguished, because I distinguished the vulnerable from the critically vulnerable. The vulnerable are those that will put up their hand and walk through a door and ask for support, or some family member on their behalf will advocate support for them, or that we can do a lot of support with in reach. The critically vulnerable are those that will never walk through any door, that don't have the voices to support them in the coherent ways that need to be had, or who have the agency to support them in the ways that can translate contact into long-term engagement. And the critically vulnerable need outreach, and that means us going to them and supporting them in the ways it should. So none of them have finished back up in jail. That's the solution to reoffending. That's the solution to reducing the incarceration toll. And none of them have finished up homeless again, to the best of my knowledge. That type of philosophy is what I've lived my whole life with, improving the life circumstance of others. And I believe that we're all allied in our responses to how we should be supporting people who are actually critically vulnerable. Through that first port of call, improving the life circumstance of a predominant family member, we improve the life circumstances of all family members. Intrafamilial issues begin to become addressed. For the most part, for myself, there's a lot of cognitive narrowing in people who have interrupted form and content, who have train-wreck childhoods, who have train-wreck family lives, and it's behavioural. It's behavioural, and it's the behaviours that we've actually got to address for the most part, and not degenerated into the presumption of aggressive complex traumas. They're living situational trauma, and that situational trauma is a constancy of trauma, composite and multiple, and it can often degenerate into aggressive complex trauma, but for the most part we can intercept that in that constancy of trauma, validate that trauma, but do not enable that trauma in terms of it being lifelong managed, and it become their predominant personality. We can disable that trauma in terms of its impacts and effects. And my work is actually experiential. I'm a researcher, but I'm not that type of researcher that's a desktop researcher, peer-reviewed by the desktop researchers. That infuriates me. And there's a lot of onus in actually us putting up a lot of respect towards desktop researchers, and believing that we're potentially a clearinghouse of overseas researchers who don't have the gospel themselves or whatever, who are also desktop researchers. The majority in many fields I actually know, whether in the suicide prevention space, which I am as versed as anyone could possibly be in, and in all the other fields that many of you are actually representative of today or whatever. We're not a clearinghouse of other people's gospels. And their research is not dissimilar to our research, and we always look to tap into something overseas when they've got the same predicaments and problems that we actually have. And the reality is the experiential is what matters. And the experiential is actually the way forward. So experiential research means going beyond surveys, going beyond the presumption of premises, and then trying to validate those premises with rationale. And that is actually what debilitates us, and debilitates us to the point that we actually affect other people's lives, because in the end we're representative of other people, and then therefore where we actually don't do the right by them, we're playing with their lives. I will be a little bit harsh today because I have, and this is a compliment to yourselves, because you are the corridors of power. You are the people with change agency. You are the ones that can actually inform those who can make the decisions in terms of the ways that should be invested forward. Research also, and this is not an attack on my colleagues, this is not an attack on my life's work. Research is done to death. There is not that much research out there that we need to keep on doing again and rebadge from whatever other vantage that can be done. I was on Late Line with the Mental Health Commissioner a couple of years ago, Professor Pat Dudgeon, and we were talking to the end of a project that we worked on, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Evaluation Project. And basically I said that the recommendations that we came up with, the 17 recommendations, much of that has been said before. And much of that is, and the recommendations aren't what are being tapped into. But I would actually ask that we do not fund more research, that we fund instead a translation of projects on the ground that improve life circumstance. There's enough research to compel that way forward, and the real research that should be compelling evidence of our day should be the experiential. That is what should be drawn from, and we go forward with that. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Evaluation Project came about because of 3 years of my campaigning with research that I willed away into the public domain, moved away from publishing in journals, because journals aren't actually read by the public domain for the most part. And I wrote 300 articles in 3 years to try and compel a way forward into understanding what is actually driving, in particular for First Nations people, the suicides. But also, my broad work is across all people. For me, it isn't racialised. For me, we're all brothers and sisters. We're all sisters and brothers. We're all one. The abominations of the last 200 years and of the human narrative that is one generic right around the world, global, is what's racialised us and distinguished us as different. We're not different. We're all much one and the same. I've sat with many people suicide affected, hundreds of First Nations families across the country, thousands in terms of over the years, cumulatively from all walks of life, and we all bear out our hearts exactly the same. We all don't want to lose another member of our families. This bit that it's all silence and taboo, that's a wider community perception. No family that I've ever sat down with has ever done the silence bit. It's always poured out its heart. The silence for them is an internalizing of grief. It's a mistrust of others, but they want to pour out their hearts. They don't want to lose someone. They want a helping hand. They want support. It's about how we resonate, spreading of the love and the resonance, and it depends who we are in terms of the people that we are and the ways that we engage with each other and where we come from and the vantage that we look from and the lens that we look for. And will determine whether we will have substantive, qualitative, long-term engagement with families and those that need our support. So, to child protection, I'm not going to say that there are families that all children should not be removed. Many should be removed. That's a fact right throughout our world. There are some families that have such train wreck childhoods for their children that they need to be removed, that the aberrant behaviour is so pronounced that they've got no other hope but that. But not 50,000 children, not 18,000 children, not potentially, if you look at it systematically, 8,500 children or 14,000 children of First Nations heritage in the Northern Territory. No way, no way. Something that Philip Brooks said yesterday, Commissioner from Queensland, that was disturbing. It was alarming to hear that 2/3 of, which goes to my research, experiential and other, whatever, right, to validate what was said, that 2/3 of non-Indigenous children are reduced because of actual risk of actual violence, but two-thirds of First Nations children are removed because of risk, of potential risk, not actual, but potential risk. That is beyond implicit bias, that is beyond implicit prejudice, that is beyond conscious prejudice, that is racism, and that is classism, and that is institutional racism, and that is discrimination, and that is vilification. And his 2/3 quantification goes in line with an argument that I've actually published that was relatively widely received, but also brought me into conflict and dispute with child protection workers. Not all of them, some of them, some of yourselves. And that was that I see no other way forward than to strip back the funding to child protection authorities. In New South Wales, Family Services, Child Protection, in other words, receives $1.8 billion a year now. In Western Australia, it's $900 million a year. And similarly so, it's in the approach to $1 billion or $2 billion, depending on the jurisdiction around the nation. What happens with the majority of that money is we hire more personnel. We hire more personnel, more caseworkers. When you hire more caseworkers, you need more load, you need more work. Instead of that being intensive family support and redefining the traditional forms of intensive family support and the entry and exit strategies or whatever, right? And instead of just relentlessly supporting in the ways that we heard the Nulla does, the First Nation Homelessness Project does, that Benunga does, that other organisations similarly do, that Bibba Willem does, that money is spent in people over-involving themselves in people's lives. I would strip back funding to child protection because there is no other way forward to 20% of what is. So then therefore, the onus will be on child protection, and I'm sure I'll get a score of questions and I'm happy to field them, and this is the type of collaborative debate that we need to have. But that we should strip back to a fifth, which would mean focus in on the critically vulnerable, focus in on those that need help, because the majority of those others will be just fine. Because I came from a working class family, from impoverished parents, from migrant parents, that if by the same criteria that children are removed today, I would have been removed as the eldest child in a latchkey existence, of a working class father who worked 2 jobs in a factory, of a mother who was a seamstress, of 2 individuals with broken bodies, of an accumulation of stresses and issues that migrants faced at a time when we were overwhelmed by language barriers, cultural barriers, and what today's casual racism, but was ugly forms of racism at that time, would have run on an everyday basis, and we had to soak that up as other people, as you people. And there were said aberrant behaviour in our family, or whatever, that would have had me removed. That would have had my 5 younger brothers and sisters removed. That is the type of criteria today, the thresholds that we actually have, and the advantage that we're looking for in this country, that are seeing rates go through the roof globally in terms of Australia's comparative data and rates. And it will get worse. Family Matters has actually drawn a lot of information and trends from me or whatever, right? And you know that where it's actually trending to now, the rates, and how many that will be removed. Philip Brooks was talking about the other day that by 2021 it'll be half in Queensland that will be First Nations children. But I'm also worried about those other children. The elevated risk groups that are now coming to the fore or whatever, right, from culturally diverse, language diverse backgrounds, who are migrants, who are experiencing the same stresses that my family experienced as a young person, and we'll see many of them removed or many of them brought into contact with child protection authorities as we've built a culture now of notifications. And there are 400,000 dob-in calls a year. I know that's loose language, and most of it is done with propriety or whatever, right? But 400,000 calls a year to child protection authorities around the country, concerned with people's circumstance and whether their children are at risk and so forth or whatever. Right? But I want some comment back. Is it fair to say that at some point when we get the opportunity, after I finish up, that child protection authorities, services around the country should be stripped back? I've gone to meetings on behalf of families, where 7 and 8 child protection workers have turned up with their pads. And the family that would have been otherwise voiceless, that would have been railroaded, was there on its own, but with me, or with another individual allied in support in that advocacy. Where would they have been? And then we've got the outcome. How is it possible? How is it possible that I can turn up to a meeting with child protection authorities when the outcome is remove them, go before the courts, time limited order, or whatever protection order they want to put in place, and then all of a sudden that outcome is circumvented? How come? That's an indictment. That's an indictment. This is the question that I want to actually ask yourselves to ask me back. How is it possible to comment that whenever I inculcate myself into the equation, or whenever some other individual likewise, be it a lawyer, a paralegal, or a strong, coherent, articulate community advocate, puts themselves into the equation, we get a different outcome. We get a different outcome. We get the retention of the family. We get the family kept together. We get more psychosocial supports put in place. We get more caseworkers all of a sudden working with the family or whatever, right? Or referring them to the appropriate authorities, or divesting themselves from that whole circumstance period whatsoever. And in the end, I'm involved in some high-profile cases that I can't identify as the National Coordinator of the National Indigenous Critical Response, also the National Migrant Support Service and other. But there are some cases that are high-profile, that the inconsistencies break my heart and challenge me even to my relationships with those in child protection systems and authorities and the high end that I deal with beyond area managers and so forth. That because of political fallout, because of reaction in the media, all of a sudden we get an about face and a reaction to that case or whatever that is anathema to the way that they would have gone about it in the first place. That is actually against their own pathways and their own first instructions to me about how we would have supported this family or what we would have done. And this kowtowing to the big end of town, this kowtowing to those above you, well, no, you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be doing that. I know a lot of you don't do that, and I know a lot of you are bleeding hearts, and I know a lot of you care. But take them on. As I took on Murdoch University Vice Chancellor, as I took on my board, and as I got 100 people across the line out of prisons and out of homelessness and across the line, and today they've got improved life circumstances, that translates to more. It's the same way that the First Nations Homelessness Project has actually reduced by 25% the evictions from public housing rental of First Nations people in Western Australia. That should be an Australian story. That should be the narrative that's carried out across the nation, but that narrative won't be carried out. And someone mentioned Thrive yesterday. Thrive in Western Australia, which is a good way forward, has actually soaked up, because we're working very closely with community services and the Department of Housing and the state government, that has actually soaked up the model from the First Nations Homelessness Project. And Thrive has actually seen the retirement of another model that wasn't doing the work that could have been done, that was called STEPS. And now it's out to tender, and it's soaked up the way. So we are learning from each other, we are collaborating, but it will take people like myself, like yourselves, to get up here on the podiums, like in the corridors of power, like with your executives, and with your and those of you who have capacity to Prime Minister and Cabinet, those of you who have capacity to policy, those of you who have capacity to Canberra and to your own jurisdictional executives and governments, to speak up. Because we're not put on this earth to betray one another. We're not put on this earth to spend our days under the sun, betraying brothers and sisters, young lives. And we're not put on this earth to forever test every potential idea that someone comes out. It isn't rocket science that is improving of life circumstance. So the National Indigenous Critical Response was born of the ATSI STEP. The ATSI STEP was born of 3 years of my life dedicated to the suicide prevention space, with impacts to my family, deprivation for me and my child, deprivation for me and my partner. Because I couldn't keep on going to communities and burying 3 children in 5 days. 3 graves in a row from one community, 5 graves in a row now in that community. Children as young as 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And for us not to see that in the media, not to see that on the front pages of our major news platforms. And what I did with my research from all that experiential, is I know I'm digressing, but I need to say this stuff, because this is my opportunity at long last to also vent back to a system that actually betrays brothers and sisters to the extent that it shouldn't, to no extent whatsoever. But I didn't publish in the Medical Journal of Australia as I was asked. I didn't get peer reviewed by my university because it was time sensitive. I published my research on how high the Kimberley suicide rates were, disaggregated, racialised, to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters on the front page of the Australian newspaper, thanks to a good journalist, on the front page of the Australian newspaper with the graphs, with the disaggregations, the elevated risks, and with the future trends on November 7, not 2014. I was smashed by my university. I was called by Prime Minister and Cabinet in Canberra. What are you doing, Gerry? Or whatever. Well, I didn't give I was asked not to swear. I don't care. I'm not going to soak up my hands in the blood of others, and I'm not going to own what I don't believe I should own. I had titles stripped from me. I had what I've gone through all my life in being a chief troublemaker, or whatever, and so forth. And but I actually launched the ATSI STEP, or whatever. I got the funding for the ATSI STEP, and from that we've got the National Indigenous Critical Response. The National Indigenous Critical Response comes in from a post-vention phase, comes in to support suicide-affected families, because in my research, experiential and other, and in the research of others, similarly so, only about 10 to 15% of families are supported, and that's usually the practical phase to the sad end of the burial. I see 3 phases in grief. I know we've got Kubler-Ross and everyone else under the sun or whatever, but 3 phases, so simplify things. To the burial, then post the burial, which is actually a very sad period, and a hollow period, and then longer term. And 10 to 15% of families, and Suicide Register in Queensland will actually also validate that. But that's the period where community, in many cases, often comes together and supports families, or whatever, to that practical period, to that, or even with the practical supports, food, psychosocial, other, some sorry business. Well, the National Indigenous Critical Response now supports, as it's rolling out across the country, 70% of suicide-affected families, First Nations. We're reaching out, and we will reach 80-90%, where we make contact with families, with that Salt of the Earth, Spread the Love approach during that critical period. We've been able to translate contact into engagement 100% of the time. 100% of the time. Now, I'd like to talk about migrant brothers and sisters too, and young people and the homeless and everyone under the sun, because the marginalised and the downtrodden and the forgotten are who I've spent my whole life with, or whatever. The stories that the nation doesn't want to hear, except in tangential media stories that we hear once in a while, that actually lose plot of where the onus should be on how we should be changing things. Migrants are actually 1/4 of the suicides in this country. The 3,000 suicides Australia-wide each year, 800 are from migrants overseas born, the majority culturally diverse, language diverse backgrounds. The elevated risk groups are Central Asians, Eastern European women, and Eastern Africans. And the Central Asians are a very high risk group, especially newly arrived migrants. We are coming to a country which is a middle to high income nation, and it's in middle to high income nations that the minorities actually get left behind. To bring to parity the suicides between First Nations and non-Indigenous, the Australian suicide rate, we've got to improve life circumstance. People are living in corrals of human misery, and the Northern Territory government should be ashamed of itself for the corrals of human misery that it actually doesn't, that's allowed to become degraded year after year. If we can't get these small reforms done about improving life circumstance, then what hope for the future? We are losing more people than we are actually helping, but what we can do is actually help as many people as we can. And look, I've run out of time. I've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to be honest with that, and I'd love to talk a lot more. But child protection cannot keep on going on, and you as caseworkers, as area managers, as district directors, as commissioners, cannot be voiceless in the public domain. You have a duty to your brothers and sisters, you have a duty to one another or whatever, to stand up and speak to the issues. And what Philip Brooks said about what he said here today or yesterday about 2/3 of children being removed because of potential risk, the nation should hear. As I actually put on the front page of the Australian, as I've actually challenged and put myself at risk often or whatever, because I'm not going to worry about titles and accolades and other supports. And I've cost myself much opportunity. I've cost myself political office because I was at odds with my own political party, and that actually saw me lose my potential Senate seat and so forth. And what I could have done in that parliament, I'm with every day of my life. In my mind, always worrisome. But at no point in time can I become that person that can compromise someone along the way to get to somewhere. Because who you are, at the end of the day, is who you are at all hours of that day, at every minute of that day. And that's who you all need to be. That's who you all need to be. You need to speak up. You can't allow these children to be removed. 80% of children should not be removed. First Nations, 80% should not be removed. Their circumstances, a predicament that's been created by the abominable wrongs of the past and the present, and we need to address them, and we've got a voice for those concerns. So social determinants are imperative. Education is an imperative. Education is a higher, it is a predominant protective factor, higher than employment, which is the next predominant factor. Children who are removed from their families are at elevated risk to suicide, to aberrant behaviour, to incarceration, and increasingly much more so. And individuals who are removed as their families, who are now fathers and who are now mothers, are the most elevated risk group to suicide. And we lose, and I will finish on this note, there was one child who hung herself from a tree in the northern suburbs of Perth, 14 years of age. 14 years of age. She had been removed from her mother at 1 year of age. That child was on the streets for years, had run from foster care. This is reflective of many children. Had run from foster care, had run from residential care, and the protection orders weren't lifted. It was just let slide. But she'd be on the streets as many others. I could tell you many of these stories of 17-year-olds who have hung themselves out on the streets or whatever, living homeless after 6 years being on the streets because they've run from residential care. Well, that child I fought with DCP to reunite her with her mother on the other side of the country. And I had to do that because that was the only shot that she had at living, period. That child is now reunited with her mother. And they are doing well. The mother is now rearing other children that she's had after being able to devolve herself from aberrant circumstance. That was family violence. And she's got 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds. And that was an indicator to me that she is doing well. Or whatever. That child now is reunited with the mother, and for now 8 months. And that reunification is one of many stories and case studies that I wanted to talk to here today or whatever, but have run out of time. And what I ask you is speak up, be more solid in the ways forward. And I apologise for the first time in my life just going all over the place, but this one is, we're not here on this earth to lose each other, and we're not here on this earth to tone down our voice, and we're not here on this earth to do less than what we should. And we have capacity for more to be done, and you have the funds and the money, and don't bleat about more funds and money, because it's not going in all the right places. Much respect.